Hey everyone, welcome back to another monthly reading wrap up. You guys already know how these videos work. I'm gonna break down every book I read in the month of February, tell you my rating, what I thought of it, what it's about, and if I would recommend it. And I have a lot of books. This was a really good reading month, so let's go ahead and get into it. First, let's start with my statistics for the month. I read 9 books, which is above my average reading amount for a month, so I'm pretty proud of myself. And across all 9 of those books, it was 4,363 pages, which is insane because most months I read about 2,500 to 3,000, so I'm almost like 1,000 or more over that in page count. Out of all 9 of these books, 2 of them were audiobook listens, and I had 1 5-star read and several almost 5-star reads. So let's get into it. I'm gonna break it down by the order I read them in. Before I start with the first book, I want to make it known that I read every single book on my TBR for this month, which literally never happens because I'm such a mood reader. But for the first time, I tried a TBR jar prompts, pick my reads, and I actually have a video up on that of me picking these books that I read. If you would want to go check that out, it is over on my channel. And the prompts picked a pretty wide variety of books, so I feel like that's why I was able to get through all of them. But that literally has never happened before. I read every single book on my TBR for the month. Let's start with the first book. So the book I started with is The Brothers Hawthorne by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. This is a continuation slash spin-off book of the Inheritance Games trilogy, which I read last year and really loved. The trilogy itself is definitely a 5-star read for me. I also did listen to this on audiobook, and I'm really glad I did because I don't think I would have gotten through it as quickly if I would have actually read it. And that's because unfortunately I did rate this book, I think 2.5 stars, maybe 2.75 stars. I really did not love this as much as the original trilogy. Basically, if you don't know what the Inheritance Games is about, the series is a YA mystery that follows our main character Avery Grams, who's been left this huge inheritance by a family she has no connection to, and she must befriend the Hawthorne brothers to try and discover like why she was left it and what her connection is to it. It's a super fun trilogy, lots of riddles and puzzles and fun clues to figure out as you go along, plus a sprinkle of romance in there. So I was super excited when I heard this book was coming out. All I knew going into it was that it was from the brothers' perspective instead of Avery's perspective, and that it took place after the events of the Inheritance Games. And I was sad to learn that this only follows 2 of the brothers' perspectives. I will say it was still a fun read. Obviously, like I said, I listened to the audiobook, and not gonna lie, I wasn't super engaged in it the whole time. I was kind of just listening to it in the background. But honestly, this felt more like 2 novellas because you're following Jameson and Grayson's perspectives, but what's happening with them is totally unrelated from each other. And I feel like this could have either been 1 much shorter book or it could have been 2 smaller novellas. This book is longer than any of the other 3 Inheritance Games, and the plot of it is just not as exciting as the other books. So honestly, I was a little bit let down, and I think that leads to why I rated it as low as I did. I still really love the characters in this world, and there is another book coming out that I will definitely be reading, but this one was just kind of a miss for me and a little bit of a letdown. And normally I feel like Jennifer Lynn Barnes writes really fast-paced plots, and while the chapters were short in this, I was not overly engaged in the story. And like I said, if I wouldn't have been listening to the audiobook, I probably would have been putting this down so frequently just because I wasn't like that interested in what was going on. It was a fun read, but definitely not one of my favorites, and like I said, I was kind of just let down. Next, I read the Happy Ever After playlist by Abby Jimenez. I've been reading a lot of her stuff lately and loving it, and decided to pick this one up. And I've realized now after reading this that this is part of an interconnected standalone situation where there's another book I was supposed to read before this, but I read them out of order, so that's okay. I still really enjoyed this book. I ended up giving it 3 stars. Like I said, I enjoyed it. I definitely don't like it as much as the other books I've read by her, but it was a fun, cute story. Essentially, the premise of this book is that our main character, Sloane, is dealing with grief from the loss of her late husband, and she finds a stray dog named Tucker that she takes in, and she can't get a hold of Tucker's owner. And finally she does. She learns his name is Jason, and they start talking over the phone because he's currently out of the country. And they kind of form this connection, and when he gets back into town, they start dating and seeing each other and hanging out. And then she learns that he is a famous musician. I think everything that Abby Jimenez writes is so sweet and cute and wholesome, and just like reading it feels like a warm hug. And I felt that way in this book as well. But I think the reason I didn't enjoy it as much as other things I've read by her is mainly due to the fact that there is a heavy miscommunication trope going on in this one. The other books I've read from her have had 3rd act conflict conflict and some miscommunication going on, but it was very, very prominent in this one. And normally I don't mind the miscommunication trope if it's done well and it makes sense, but in this case I just felt like it was unnecessary and it was super dragged out, and almost the entire second half of the book revolved around this conflict, and I didn't really love that. I just kept thinking to myself, if they would just talk it out, then we wouldn't be having this issue. Another thing is that the pacing felt a little bit odd to me. The first half of the book I really, really loved, and it was on track to be like a 4-star, 4.5 star, but the second half of the book took a total 180. The plot was entirely different. It was lacking some of the really enjoyable side characters from the first half of the book, and I don't know, I just began to feel disconnected from the story and from the characters as the book went on. I will also say this was kind of insta-lovey, and I do think personally I felt like a lot of the connection that the two main characters had was more physical than emotional, which isn't typically something that I'm like obsessed with in books. I didn't mind it, and I still had a really, really fun time reading this book, and I will be reading many more of Abby Jimenez's books, but just compared to the other books I've already read by her, this one's at the bottom of the list. Again, still a really fun book, still enjoyable, highly recommend it, but not my favorite by any means, and that's why I gave it a 3-star. Next up, I read Magnolia Park's The Long Way Home. I actually did this one on audio, and if you've seen some of my other videos where I talk about this series, I frequently say that the reason I choose to listen to this series on audio, one, because there are multiple voice actors depending on the characters, which really helps me feel immersed into the story. But aside from that, this is taking place in London in the UK, and when I read a book, I'm reading it in an American accent, but obviously the audiobook is in a British accent, which also helps me feel even more immersed into the story, and it helps like some of the slang kind of make sense in the context they're being used in. So for me, it's just easier to digest it and appreciate the story when I'm listening on audio versus reading. I've also said in other videos in the past, I did not love the first Magnolia Parks book at all. I just remember being a little bit annoyed with how toxic the relationships were, but then I did enjoy the first Daisy Hates book and decided to keep pushing into this one. And oh my gosh, I am now understanding the hype behind this series, because I felt so emotionally torn apart and put back together by this book, and I have a newfound appreciation for the characters in this story. They are flawed and they are toxic, but that is what I love about the characters. I will say I still don't love Magnolia and BJ's story as much as I love Daisy and Christian's story, but this book made me change my mind about Magnolia and BJ. I honestly can say I strongly disliked them when reading the first book, but in this one, their chemistry and their connection and the emotional impact this had on me was just so much stronger, and I just enjoyed this story so much more than I did the first Magnolia Parks book, and it made me very excited to continue the series with the next Daisy book and with the final Magnolia Parks book. This series, the Magnolia Parks universe, often gets advertised as romance, and I strongly disagree with that. I would say it's more of a dramatized fiction. Obviously there is romance going on, but all of the relationships taking place in this series are very toxic and very unrealistic. And so I think for me, when I first started it, that was very off-putting because I was expecting it to be a romance, and it's really not. I don't know how to explain it, but if you guys are interested in it, I would recommend jumping into the series and giving it a try. At least get through the first Daisy book before you completely write it off, because I'm so glad I kept pushing through it. But go into it knowing that it is extremely toxic, and maybe look up trigger warnings, because there are a lot of serious topics discussed in this series and things that the characters deal with that are pretty upsetting. It's not a romantic story by any means. Obviously, like I said, there are relationships going on, but that is something I did not understand when first going into the series. But now that I have a better idea of the character dynamics, I am highly enjoying this, and it really is just a character study. There's nothing like super crazy about the plot going on, but it's just enjoyable to read about these characters' lives and the relationships they're in and the trauma that they're dealing with. And yeah, I really love this one. I think I gave this 4.5 stars, which is crazy coming from how much I disliked / felt confused about the first book. I didn't dislike the first book, I just was off put by it. I highly recommend reading this and at least just seeing if it's for you. I know a lot of people have mixed feelings about this, and typically people have very strong feelings about this series. They either love it or they hate it, so I would just say give it a try for yourself and see what you think, because personally I really enjoyed this one and I cannot wait to keep reading the series. Next up, I read Gold by Raven Kennedy. This This is the 5th book in the Plated Prisoner series, which in my opinion is one of the most underrated fantasy romance series on the internet. This series is loosely, and when I say loosely, I mean super loosely, based. Honestly, I would say more inspired by than loosely based. But it's inspired by the legend of King Midas, you know, the king that everything he touches turns to gold. But it's also fae, and the politics of this world kind of remind me of Game of Thrones. It's definitely a very dark fantasy romance, and initially when I began this series, I absolutely hated the first book. Like, it was awful. And then I kept pushing, and I slowly started to fall more in love with the world and the characters, and every book I read, my rating just kept getting higher and higher until, for me, books 3 and 4 were automatic 5 stars. I ate them up. Up until this book, I was obsessed with the enemies to lovers, the tension, the banter, the slow burn. It was amazing. Everything I like in a fantasy romance book. So I was super excited to go into this book because it is the newest release in the series, and the one before this I read over a year ago, and it left off on a crazy cliffhanger. These are also very long books, but in my past experience, I have flown through them pretty quickly just because the plot's so amazing. With this one, honestly, I was pretty let down, but we spend this entire book where the two main characters, the two most important characters, never interact with each other in the entire book. They're not ever in the same place, and we're jumping back between their two POVs, but all you want in the book is for them to be together, and they never are. I started thinking this is gonna be what the big ending is. It's gonna feel like this big relief, this big weight off our shoulders, and the two characters are finally gonna reunite. But no, we did not get that. They are entirely separated for the whole book, and I felt extremely frustrated. I honestly don't mind a separation trope, especially in a fantasy romance, because I think there are ways to do it right because you're just waiting for that reunion moment. But look how long this book is. They never interacted, and that drove me crazy. It was still enjoyable, but this one was heavily politics centered and less to do with the romance, which is something that I was really loving about the series up until now, and I felt like it was building up and continuing to get better to then just be cut off, and there was like a drop off in my enjoyment of reading it. I'm not saying this to discourage anyone from reading the series because, like I said, I do think it is the most underrated fantasy romance series on the internet, and I want to urge everyone to go read it and to push through the first book, because you kind of have to suffer through the first book to then enjoy the rest of the books. And I did still enjoy this one. I had a fun time reading it, and I finished it quickly. There was just so many little things I was frustrated with, and I can't fully dive into that without giving spoilers. But yeah, I was pretty let down by this one just because the previous books I had loved so much and were 5-star reads for me, but this one just fell a little bit flat in my opinion, and for that I gave it 3 stars because I do still love the world and these characters, and I would still recommend the series as a whole. If you're planning on diving into this, definitely look up trigger warnings. I think the book may list them also, but it is definitely a very dark fantasy. It's a very cruel world that it's set in, and it deals with some heavier topics, so definitely be wary of that if you are planning to jump into it. But in my opinion, this series is still worth it. Even though this one let me down, I'm hoping that it will go up from here, and I will continue to enjoy the rest of the series like I had before this book. And even though this one let me down, it was still a 3-star, which is good in my opinion, but just not as good as the rest of the series. That's what I thought about Gold. After that, I read a book that I've been wanting to read for a very long time. I often see people talking about it on TikTok and on YouTube, just saying how much they love this book and how beautiful the writing is. And given that February was like Valentine's Day and all about love, I thought it would be the perfect time to read this book. And that book is The 7-Year Slip by Ashley Poston. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but oh my gosh, this book was incredible. And I actually annotated this book. I on occasion will highlight quotes in books, but I never have like fully annotated a book from start to finish, but I knew just from what I'd heard about it that the writing was going to be beautiful. I did highlight different quotes and like coordinated the colors to their meanings. Blue highlighted quotes were sad quotes. The yellow highlighted quotes were just like really great writing, if that makes sense. Like I just thought like, wow, this quote is great writing. And then the orange ones were like heartwarming or romantic moments. And I'm gonna flip through it again so you guys can see literally how much I annotated. Like it's almost every single page I highlighted something. I think also annotating it helped me become more immersed into the story and fall more in love with these characters. So basically this book is unlike anything I've ever read. I would compare it to a contemporary romance, but it's also magical realism, but not in any sense of it being like complicated to understand. I feel like I'm not making any sense, so I'm just gonna explain the premise of the book. Essentially, this book is about our main character, Clementine, who is struggling with grief after her aunt's passing, and she moves into her aunt's old apartment, which her aunt used to always spin these tales about how the apartment was magical, and Clementine always just kind of wrote it off as like, oh, that's just my aunt telling a fun story. However, one day she goes into her apartment and the furniture looks exactly like her aunt's old apartment and not the way she decorated it, and she learns that there is a man living in the apartment and his name is Ewan. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I read it in my head as Ewan, and essentially Ewan is from 7 years in the past and she is living in the present, and the only place that this time slip exists is in the apartment. So she doesn't know when she leaves and comes back if she'll be coming back to her apartment or to the 7 years in the past apartment. And essentially she forms this bond with Ewan and they become super close, but she is very wary of actually making a relationship out of it. Then she meets future Ewan and she's kind of dealing with like talking to present and past Ewan. I feel like I'm making it sound like it's confusing, but it really wasn't. It was super easy to understand. Like I said, it's magical realism, but it is not complicated by any means. It really didn't even feel like there were magical elements going on. It felt like a contemporary fiction romance that just happened to have a little sprinkle of magical realism going on in there. When I tell you the writing is some of the best writing I've ever read, it's so lyrical, so beautiful. The way that Ashley Poston is able to string together these beautiful sentences to tell this story that I felt so connected to, like, I was just shocked. This was amazing. I like reading contemporary romance, but it's definitely not my favorite genre by any means, and I have never felt more connected to a contemporary romance than I did to this book. I definitely want to read more by Ashley Poston in the future because this one just like hit me so hard. I can't say anything else about it other than that I highly recommend it, and it was super quick to get through. It was so enjoyable, so beautiful. Romance was great, but also like even just the smallest, most mundane things the main character would be doing seemed amazing by the way that this author wrote it and made everything just so poetic. I'm gonna stop rambling now and let you guys know that I did give this, I think, either a 4.5 or 4.75. I don't know what it was. I just didn't quite get the 5-star feeling from it, but I did really like it, and I don't know, it was just shy, just barely shy of a 5-star, but I still highly recommend it, and this is one of my favorite books I read this month, and I wish I would have read this sooner. Next up, I read one of my book of the month box picks, which was The Fury by Alex Michaelides. I never know if I'm saying his last name correctly, but when I read it, it sounds like Michaelides in my head, and this is the author who wrote The Silent Patient, which is hugely popular on the internet, and I have read The Silent Patient, and it kind of let me down because I kept hearing how amazing the plot twist was, and then I guessed the plot twist, so I didn't really have very high hopes going into this one. I still enjoyed The Silent Patient, but I guess I just didn't really understand what all the hype was about, but I wanted to pick this one up, honestly, mostly because the cover looks so cool. All I knew about it is that it's set on a remote island in Greece and that it was kind of like a whodunit story, which is exactly what it was, and it was super fun. It reminded me of the movie Glass Onion and Knives Out, if you guys have seen those. Very much similar vibes to that, kind of like a misfit group of friends and people who know each other, and a murder takes place and they're just kind of trying to figure out who did it and what the motive was and how they missed it. The way it was written was super interesting to me. I don't really know how to explain it. It's one of those things where you just kind of have to read it for yourself, but the voice it was written in and the perspective it was written in and the way the story was told, I really enjoyed. That was probably actually my favorite part about the book. Like I said, it was a super fun read. I mean, it was a murder mystery. Who's not gonna have fun with that? But I 100% knew what the plot twist was, like, from right off the bat. There were some parts of the story that kind of just felt slow and pointless to me. It's already a pretty short book, but I definitely think there was some parts that could have been omitted that didn't really matter as much to the story. But either way, I did have a good time reading it. There wasn't really much I strongly disliked about it. It just definitely wasn't one of my favorite thriller reads ever. And I ended up giving it 3 stars, I think. I believe I gave it 3 stars. I would definitely recommend it. Like I said, not my favorite thriller book, but it was still a fun and enjoyable read. 3 stars for The Fury. I then read a book that I've been putting off for a really long time. This book and series kind of blew up on TikTok in 2023, and I don't know why I'd been putting it off so long. Probably because the books are so long and I was in the middle of so many other series, but I finally took a chance on it and I'm so glad I did, and that book is The Serpent and the Wings of Night by Carissa Broadbent. I had heard that this book was like ACOTAR and The Hunger Games. but vampires. In some senses, I can see how it's like that, but to me, this story was very, very unique. This is an adult fantasy romance, and it is about vampires, but I would compare the vampires more to how fae are being portrayed in a lot of really popular series currently. So in that sense, I get the ACOTAR comparison. They're vampires, but they're not your traditional, like, scared of garlic, sparkle in the sun type of vampires. They're more just like otherworldly beings, if that makes sense. A lot of them have magical powers. I'm not gonna sit here and try to explain the world building of this book because that definitely was a lot to take in, but essentially it's about our main character. Her name is Oraya. Once again, here's another word that I don't know how to pronounce, but I say Oraya. She is a human who was brought up by the king of the vampires, and she doesn't really understand why he saved her life, but she lost her family and he took her in and raised her to be this like ruthless, cold-blooded warrior. I really, really enjoyed reading from her perspective because she's just so cool. Essentially, there are these trials that happen every so often where anyone can enter themselves in, and the winner gets a gift from the goddess, basically anything they want. And what she wants is to become a vampire because she's grown up in this world full of vampires where they see her as prey, and she is a human. So she enters into these trials and she meets this vampire named Rain who ends up wanting to ally her, and she's super confused why he wants to ally with her because he's a vampire, so they're enemies, but she ends up agreeing to it and it kind of takes off from there. I really can't explain anything else without giving anything away, but the tension is crazy, the slow burn is crazy, it's enemies to lovers. I ate up every second of the romance in this, but also the action and politics and world building and magic system were fantastic, and the writing flowed so well that I didn't even think about the fact that like, oh, I'm learning world building right now. Like, I never had to stop and like think about what I was reading, if that makes sense. Usually when I'm starting a fantasy series, it takes me like a hot minute to get into it and fully understand the world we're in, but right off the bat with this one, things were just like clicking in my head as I was reading it. I flew through it. It was such a page turner. I can't believe I put off reading this so long. If you hadn't already guessed it, this was my 5-star read for the month. This book was so long and I flew through it in less than 24 hours, I think. I literally have no bones to pick with this book. The ending had the most insane plot twist, and I had heard there was a plot twist at the end, but what happened is not even close to what I would have ever guessed, and it made me so excited to go into the next book. I think I've made a video on TikTok before called like, if you read ACOTAR and loved it, don't know what to read next, read this. I would definitely add this book to that list. While I wouldn't compare it directly to ACOTAR, it did give me the same, like, similar type of feelings I got from ACOTAR, which does not happen a lot, and for that, I absolutely loved it. And I don't know, I just had that 5-star feeling when I finished the book, and it was the perfect blend of fantasy and romance. I just ate up every second of this book. I'm gonna stop rambling now, and all I'm gonna say is to go read this book. It was a 5-star read, and I will definitely be finishing this series soon and reading more things by Carissa Broadbent. Next up, I read a book that if I hadn't drawn a prompt that called for this book in my TBR video for last month, I probably wouldn't have picked up for a really long time simply because I didn't know anything about it, and that is Filthy Rich Vampire by Geneva Lee. I got sent this in PR. Shout out and thank you to Red Tower Books with Entangled Publishing for sending me this. But I believe the prompt I had was like a book with purple on the cover, and all my purple books are either books I've already read, books that are like second or third book in a series, or this. So this was literally my only option. And I picked it up and it ended up being kind of just like the perfect palette cleanser book I needed between Serpent and the Wings of the Night and the next book I'm gonna get to. I'm gonna go ahead and let you guys know the rating. I think I gave this 3.5 stars. It definitely is not my favorite book of all time, but was it super fun to read? Yes. I was like kicking my feet and giggling. I guess you could classify this book as fantasy romance, but light on the fantasy. It is about vampires, but it's set in like the modern world, and the like magical and like fantasy part of it is very, very minimal, kind of more just like the backdrop than on the forefront. And this is about a vampire named Julian who's been asleep for like a lot of years. I don't even remember how long, but basically when he wakes up, he doesn't even know what a cell phone is, and he has to attend this gala because the vampires in this world have like a social season where they're basically trying to marry off all their kids, and I guess they like see themselves sort of as elite. They're all super rich, hence the rich part of the title. And at the gala, his eyes catch on a cellist who is playing music, and her name is Thea, and he's like instantly like taken aback by how beautiful she is. Basically things go from there. I'm not going to explain. This was definitely a super spicy, super fun, super quick, fast-paced read. Not too much substance to it, basically just romance with like the vampire background setting. Like I said, super fun read, really enjoyed it. Definitely not my favorite book in the entire world, but I'm so glad I read it because it's a great little palate cleanser, a fun read. I didn't have to think too much while reading it. Like, it literally took zero brain power. I could just read it and enjoy myself. It kind of actually left on a pretty big cliffhanger, and I learned that there's other books in the series, so the next time I need a little palate cleanser that I know will be like a fun and easy read, I'll probably pick up the rest of this series or the next book in this series because I did really like it. And like I said, I gave it a 3.5 stars. I definitely really enjoyed it, but I don't think I could give it a 4-star or higher just because the plot was like pretty simple and I wasn't like obsessed with any of the characters or feeling super connected to them, but I had a fun time reading it and I absolutely flew through it. So if you're looking for a palate cleanser but you still want something that's romantic and is fantasy, I highly recommend checking out this book, and I was pleasantly surprised with how much I enjoyed it and how much fun I had with it. Next book, I don't even know if I'm ready to talk about. I'm currently reading the second book in the series that this book is in, and it's basically all I can think about. And it's also not a book I was expecting to love as much as I did. I mostly was intrigued to read this book because I knew what it was about and I'd heard people saying how much they loved it, and I was kind of like, really? That book is Binding 13 by Chloe Walsh, and I now understand all of the hype. I can't even explain to you why I love this book so much, but I do. I ate up every second of this book. It ripped my heart out. I feel like I know these characters personally. Like, I cannot get enough of the world they're in. I feel like this book is super talked about on the internet, but if you don't already know what it is, this is a high school sports romance between a star rugby player and a new girl at school with a dark past. Their names are Johnny and Shannon, and this is taking place in Ireland, which at first when I started reading this book, I was like kind of confused because there's so much Irish slang in the book that there was like constantly words that I had no clue what they meant. But thankfully the author actually has a glossary in the front of the book explaining what different Irish slang terms mean, and there's also a name pronunciation guide, which was super helpful because, for example, there's a character whose name is spelled A-O-I-F-E, which I would have pronounced like Aoife, which I knew was wrong when I first read it, but apparently it's actually pronounced like Aoife, and I never would have known that. But the name pronunciations and the glossary were so helpful, and by like honestly like the 3rd or 4th chapter, I was like going with the flow and things were making more sense to me. This book, similarly to the Magnolia Park series, is honestly more of a character study. The plot itself is nothing crazy. The dynamics between these characters, chef's kiss. It is literally perfect. I'm obsessed. And I was also really surprised because when I had heard about this book, I learned that it took place at Tom College, which I assumed was an actual college because in America, college is like university, like past high school. But Tom College is actually a private high school, and these characters are in high school. So I was expecting this to be like adult, and honestly it was. Like, even though these characters are high school, the things they're dealing with and the way these things are discussed and the thought process these characters are having and their perspectives is definitely not YA by any means, which kind of threw me off guard at first because they are high school characters, and I don't know if I've ever read a book where the main characters are high schoolers but it's not YA. This very much felt like an adult romance, and I can't even like get into what this book is about. Like, I can't even, first of all, I don't think I could describe it without spoiling things, but also like I like emotionally am not prepared to talk about what this book is about, and I'm currently into the second book and loving it just as much. I initially rated this book 4.75 stars, and if you're on my Goodreads, you probably saw that, and I even waited like 48 hours before posting what my rating was because I was so torn. But now it's been several days later, and I would like to revise my rating to a 5-star read. I think initially the reason I gave it 4.75 instead of 5 was because there were some moments that were like a little bit cringy to me, but then I had to kind of put it in perspective and remind myself these are just high schoolers who are dealing with very serious things, and when I did that, it made the cringy things seem less cringy, if that makes sense. I don't know, if you've read this book, what I'm talking about is the way that the main male character and his best friend discuss an injury he has, That's what icked me out a little bit. But then I have to remember that these are literally teenagers, and it's kind of just like in a joking manner. And if you haven't read this book, please ignore everything I'm saying. It's gonna make no sense. Oh my god, I'm obsessed with this book. Like, this might be one of my new favorites. It ripped my heart out. It put my heart back together. I could not put this book down, and it's a long one. I think on Goodreads it's listed as being like 800 something pages. This book is only 600 something, but it's a different format because it's like a longer, like a taller paperback. Long book, and the pages are like Bible thin pages. Like, that was 2 pages. They're so thin, and I still flew through it. It was so good. Like, I cannot stop thinking about these characters. Day and night, I'm thinking about these characters. I just feel for them so hard. There was definitely some parts that made me feel really sad. This is another one of those that definitely look up trigger warnings, and they are listed, I believe, in the back of the book. But this deals with some super serious topics and discussions that are definitely not for the faint of heart, and it did make me feel extremely sad at parts, but also there were so many heartwarming moments that made me fall in love with the characters even more. And just hearing and experiencing their perspectives as they're dealing with the things they're dealing with ripped my heart out. How many times have I said ripped my heart out? You guys know I must be telling the truth. I could not recommend this book anymore. Originally a 4.75 stars, I am revising that to a 5-star read. And this is like one of the first non-fantasy books I've given a 5-star to in quite a while. I can't believe I didn't pick this up sooner, but I'm so glad that I did, and I will be continuing the rest of the series. And I know I'm gonna get my heart broken a million more times, but I finally understand what the hype is about, and I can't believe I ever judged people from hearing the description of this. I literally judged people for thinking this could be a 5-star read. It's perfection. Chloe Walsh, what did you do to me? So that is my completed February reading wrap up. First of all, I'm so proud of myself for reading as many books as I did. And there's several really long books in there. And honestly, not sure how I did it. Like, I really have no clue. I'm hoping to have another really great reading month in March. And if you want to see the books on my March TBR, I just posted a video where the TBR jar picks my March TBR list. So definitely go check that out. And head over to my TikTok and Instagram page. Give me a follow over there. Check out my content. They will be linked in the description below. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It would really help me out. Comment below if you've read any of these books that I read in February and what you thought of them, or if you haven't read them, did this video make you want to read any of them? I'm super curious, and I would love to chat all things books. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye guys.